I'll let him kind of get into it, but it has been a very exciting first year, I would say, for you. Very tumultuous one in many ways. A lot of big surprises. But I'm sure most of y'all here know this, but I actually kind of got my start in politics when I decided to volunteer for Barry Loudermilk's campaign back when he was running in State House, and I was just so impressed with him. And like I said, I've worked on a number of campaigns over the years, but Barry was one that when I was knocking doors, I didn't have to turn my head away, I didn't have to blink my eyes or cross my fingers when I said, this is a man of integrity that you can trust. If he says something, he's going to do it. And so it's been wonderful to see that even in the pressure cooker of Washington, D.C., and even facing some pressures from donors that he probably won't tell you about it, but I've heard about it in private conversations. But he has stood his ground, and he has done what's right for the people of Bartow County, the people of District 11, and the people of the United States. So I'm proud to call him my friend, and I'm excited that he is our congressman. So very loud.
Well, thanks, Louis. And you know, you said it's not easy, and it isn't, and it's going to get more difficult. If you think about it, go back to June the 6th, 1944, when Americans landed on the beaches of Normandy at D-Day. It wasn't easy. In fact, it was hard. In fact, they took a lot of casualties. But they were taking ground that had been taken. They were taking back. They were fighting for liberty. Whenever you fight for liberty, it's not easy. In fact, it gets difficult, and it's going to get more difficult than we have it right now. But the difference is, just as with our founders and those that fought in the Continental Army during the Revolution, you know, Washington lost more battles than he won. Washington retreated more than he advanced, because Washington knew that this was a long-term battle. This was a long-term war. They were at war for 8 years. And every time that he would turn and retreat, it was because the battlefield did not favor the engagement, and the rules of engagement did not favor him to win. And so he retreated many more times than he advanced. But when he advanced is when he had this strategic advantage, when the battlefield was in his favor, and he knew he had a chance to win. The thing that kept Washington going, the same thing that kept our soldiers going in World War II, is they had their vision upon their cause, not the circumstances that were around them. They didn't let a defeat determine the outcome of the next engagement, because they kept their eyes upon the long-term cause, which was freedom, which was liberty. I guess about 15, 16 years ago, I got involved in politics by doing what Louis is doing right now. I had a moment of the loss of common sense and decided that I would run for chairman. After a lot of coaxing, run for chairman of the Bartow County Republican Party. I drug along some other people that I knew that shared the same vision that I shared. I met people like Wayne Rice. But I knew people that shared the same vision I did, that of our founders, of strong constitutional values, and the Honeke's here got involved in. I mean, we sort of did like Ronald Reagan. I didn't know too many people. I got to know Wayne. I got to know some others because I was attending Republican Party meetings. But you see, when Ronald Reagan, he had this vision of a shining city on a hill. It was a vision of America. He was running a very positive campaign. But he didn't necessarily know the establishment Republican base, and he had been a Democrat, but he really didn't know or identify with the establishment Democrat base. He created a new base. And so we kind of took the same approach. We brought a bunch of people into the Republican Party to help us, and many of those are around now today. But the reason I say that is I've been fighting this fight, directly engaged, for about 15 years. I've always been involved. My dad was a World War II veteran. In fact, my dad touched those shores at D-Day. He was a medic in World War II. He was at the Battle of the Bulge. And he instilled in me some very deep values. And even growing up, I grew up in Clayton County as well. Grew up in Riverdale. And there weren't too many Republicans back then, but my dad was one of them. And I remember we were probably one of the few families that didn't vote for Jimmy Carter back when he ran for president. Of course, I wasn't old enough to vote, but I remember my family talking about it. We've been fighting this fight to restore America back to the vision of our founding fathers for 15 years. We're on the verge of a movement to do that. But we're also on the verge of this entire movement that we've been working on for 15 years collapsing before our eyes. Because every time that we go to a mountain and we try to take that mountain, we expel the first 2 magazines of ammunition on each other before we even attack the hill. If we're going to win this war, if we're going to restore liberty back to this nation, we got to learn one thing. None of us in this room agree on everything. If you find somebody you absolutely agree upon in every aspect, you're probably looking in the mirror. And then I'd be very skeptical of the person on the other side, because you know what? My dad told me this growing up. He said, son, right now, when you're 18 years old, you think you know everything. But I learn something new every day. You're not the same person today you were 15, 20 years ago, because as you grow older, you grow wiser. There's some things that I learned the hard way too. And early on in politics, there wasn't a hill that wasn't worth fighting. There wasn't a hill that wasn't worth taking. And I fought many battles that were not strategically minded, but they were emotionally driven. And we lost a lot of hills. That's kind of where we are in the conservative movement today. Our vision of victory, our definition of victory is how many bodies we count at the base of the hill still clutching the "Don't Tread on Me" flag. The more bodies, the greater the victory, but we have never taken the hill. It's time to start taking hills. I'm tired of losing, because my granddaughter deserves better than what we're passing. It's time to win. And the first thing we have to do to win is to realize that our friend to the left of us and friend to the right, and I'm not speaking politically, I'm talking physically, those that are on the battlefield with us on the left side and the right side, if they share the same vision that we have, but they don't agree with us on everything, it doesn't make them our enemy. It makes them a comrade in arms. I was deeply concerned about the status of where we are in the Republican Party recently, and let me share just a quick story with you. Something's always bothered me all my life. Growing up in a Christian home, my family had us reading the Bible from early age, because my dad always told me, he said, look, there isn't a problem that you'll face in life that the answer is not inside the Bible. And again, this is one of those things you learn. You can read Scripture 15, 20 different times, and then you read it the 21st time and you see something you never saw before. One thing's always bothered me, and this isn't a sermon, this is a political lesson. There are a lot of political lessons that you can find in the Bible. This is a political lesson that I think applies to us today. Jeremiah 17:9 tells us that the heart is deceitfully wicked. What it's saying is, do not make decisions off your emotions. If you make a decision off your emotion, you will be deceived. I've always wondered why, when Jesus entered into Jerusalem on Sunday, he was held as a deliverer, but 4 days later, the same people that waved palms declared that he was the Son of God voted to execute him. Voted to execute him in 4 days. What happened? Did Jesus change in 4 days that much that he went from being there to, let's put it in modern terms, he went from being a conservative deliverer to a liberal leftist, part of the establishment? In 4 days? No. What happened is, word had made it to Jerusalem of this guy who quite possibly could be the deliverer, the Messiah. Now, the Jews for 10 years, since 26 AD, had lived under a very oppressive rule of Pontius Pilate. He was the prefect over all of Judea. He had ruled with an iron fist. From him, he just didn't have any regard for Jewish law, Jewish tradition. He carried effigies of Caesar into the temple, which was a violation of Jewish law. He went in and raided the temple treasure. He didn't see a problem with it. It was money that had been taxed from the Jews, and he wanted to build a water system for them, an aqueduct. So he went and took their temple treasure. But to the Jews, that was a violation of their God, their Jewish law. He ruled so heavily that some insurrections had started, rebellions had started, marches against Rome, and he suppressed those very heavily. Caesar actually told Pontius Pilate, he said, if this happens again, you're gone. You better find a way of getting peace in Jerusalem. So the people have been looking for their deliverer. The last miracle that Jesus did was in Bethany, which was a suburb of Jerusalem. You could actually see the temple from Bethany, and that was when he raised Lazarus from the dead, the greatest miracle. So that news immediately traveled into Jerusalem. So on Sunday, when Jesus rides into Jerusalem, all the Jews come out and they're hailing him as the Son of God, their deliverer, their Messiah, waving palms. But the problem was they were driven by their emotions. They didn't listen to what he said. They were just driven by their emotions. So their idea was, here he comes, he's going to ride that donkey straight over to Pontius Pilate's palace. He's going to do all those miracles we heard about and overthrow Rome. But he didn't. He went to the temple and he overthrew the money changers. That's where those guys made their living. Well, he was arrested. Now they think, okay, he's going to go over to, now he's arrested, he's going to do those miracles and overthrow Pontius Pilate. But he didn't. He submitted himself to the power of the civil government. As he had said when he was ministering, render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. There is a role of the civil authority. And even though he was unjustly being prosecuted, he did submit to the judicial authority of the Roman government. So now all these people that are looking for their deliverer are thinking, what is this guy? Pilate was in a very difficult position. He knew his job was on the line. He knew if there was one more riot, Caesar would remove him from power. He had to come up with a situation. He even had his wife telling him, you better not do anything. This guy. And you know, that has a pretty big influence on you when your wife's telling you to do something. But he knew that if he just let Jesus go, then Caiaphas's folks, those that followed the Orthodox Jews, would riot. But if he just punished Jesus and executed Jesus, then Jesus' followers would riot. So he had a very difficult position. So here's the political lesson that he left us. He figured out a scheme. He figured out a political way out of this that was rock solid. It would make everybody happy. It would quell the emotions that were growing among the people. So he knew Caesar would let him release one prisoner because it was Passover. He got to choose one prisoner he could release out of prison. So he said, I'll tell you what I think I'm going to do. Instead of me releasing, I'm going to let them choose. I'm going to let them vote and choose which prisoner they release, and I'll go pick the absolute worst prisoner that we have. Because I know this guy's innocent. He's delusional. Pilate says he's delusional. He thinks he's a king. He thinks he's the son of God, but that's no crime against Rome. So I'll go get the worst guy we have in prison, and I'll just let them choose. And obviously they're scared of this guy, Barabbas. If you read the first two Gospels, says he was in prison for murder and thievery. I don't think he could have gone before the magistrate, right? That would have gone to a higher court. He was in prison for murder and thievery. So he gets Barabbas and he brings him out, but he made two political errors. The third error he made was it was just providence. It was going to happen either way, but he says, let me get this worst guy, and we're going to let him choose between just some delusional guy and an actual murderer. Well, his first problem was he didn't consider Barabbas' name. Barabbas' name was actually Jesus Barabbas. If you read the writings of Josephus and some of the Roman writings, his name was Jesus Barabbas. And in Hebrew, Barabbas is Bar Abba, son of the Father. So if you think about the irony here, you have two people with the same name. Jesus, son of the Father, and Jesus, Messiah, son of God. His second error was he really didn't understand what was at stake. Because the reason Barabbas was in prison then, if you go and you read the other two Gospels, he was in prison for inciting insurrections against Rome. He was part of the Securi, which was an extreme group of zealots who didn't follow Jewish law, but they were Jewish patriots. They were not they were not Orthodox Jews that worship, but they were flag-waving Jews that wanted a Jewish state. And they were willing to resort to violence to do that. They were the extremists. But yet, he would also resort to killing Jews or whatever he had to do to achieve what he was doing. They were an extreme group that was known as the Essenes. It was a security. So he was actually in prison for inciting a riot against Rome. So now, the choice. The Jewish people were given a choice. Remember, they've been in tyranny for all this time. They've been under oppression. And they're given a choice. Do we get Jesus Barabbas, the rebel, or do you get Jesus, the son of the Father who claims to be the Messiah? When they were given the choice to vote, this is what they decided. Give us Barabbas. Even though we disagree with him, even though we're afraid of him, even though he doesn't follow our laws, at least he's doing something. This other guy's only talking. This is the dangerous place that we're in today. With all these folks that are running for office. None of them are perfect. I know most all of them. And I've known them for years. And I know they're human. I know that they were made in the image of God, but I also know that because of a fall in the garden, none of us are perfect. None of us. And we will make mistakes. But we can't destroy each other in the process because we all have to be dedicated toward a greater good. Now that I kind of laid some groundwork, I'll get into some things that are happening, some good news. And what's amazing is I go around and I start talking about the good things that are happening. People are saying, what do you mean good things are happening? What do you mean good things are happening? How can it be we're in the worst case we've ever been in this nation? Tell me how good things are happening. That's what I'm hearing because people are reacting emotionally and I understand why. But as my daughter said the other day, it made me think. She said, you know what, Dad, I got up this morning, I got in the car, and I drove to the store. Nobody told me where I had to go. I didn't have to log down anything in the logbook of where I drove. I didn't have to have a document with me showing that I had the right to go to this store. I pulled out of my wallet, I spent my own money at my leisure. Nobody told me what I had to buy or how much I could buy. When I drove back home, I didn't have a government agent, at least she didn't know about, following me. And we had no one from the government knocking on our door. We still got a lot of liberty. We still got a lot of good that's happening. Now, what we're afraid of is the future. I want you to go back to 2008. 2008, Barack Obama was elected as President of the United States. Now, I want you to understand something. We live in a nation that elected him twice. Okay? So not everybody in this nation feels the way we do in this. They should, but they don't feel the way that we do in this room today. So we have to have the reality of that. Second of all, we had a Democrat-controlled House and we had a Democrat-controlled Senate. What happened? You got Obamacare. You got Dodd-Frank. And you got a second round of bailouts that have tremendously put this nation in much greater debt than we have been in.
Stimulus.
We got the stimulus. Yeah. Since the Republicans have controlled the House and the Senate, none of that has happened. So understand this. Sometimes winning is standing your ground. Now, I bring that up because as we're going into this next campaign, one of the things that we have to do is manage the expectations of our voters. And that's one thing that we haven't done very well. And for the candidates in here, that would be my greatest advice. You better manage the expectation of your voters, because during our campaign, that was one of the things that we made a priority. Is when you campaign on honesty and integrity, because one of the problems we do is we want to throw the reddest piece out there that would cause everybody to cheer and holler. Have that one-liner that everybody would go talk about. One of the greatest instances is whenever we would do campaign speeches or forums, the question would always come up, what are you going to do about Obamacare? One of my opponents, who's actually friend of mine, Bob Barr, he and I just met the other day. We've been meeting occasionally, and he's an advisor to us, and we go way back. But one of the things Bob said, which I thought was an error, is he would say, because this is what we do, look, I'm gonna burn it, I'm gonna throw its ashes across the four corners of the earth. We're gonna destroy it. Those are those kind of red meat things we kept throwing out there. The other candidates would say the same thing. We are going to repeal Obamacare. And this is the way we campaign. There's nothing critical against them, but that's just the way Republicans have always campaigned. We always throw the reddest piece of meat out there that would incite our base, say, we're going to go to this guy, because we like what he's saying. But this was a difficult position for us because I realized the reality is, I can't do it. In Congress, I can't do it. I'm one of 435 members, and it takes 218 in the House of Representatives to do anything. Second of all, the reality is, we're not repealing Obamacare as long as Obama's in the White House. The system that our founders set up says he has to sign any bill, and he ain't going to do it. And we're not going to have the votes to override his veto. That's a fact. So the reality going in is I say, look, I think we should repeal. We have to repeal. It's not going to work. It's going to collapse under its own weight. It will have to go away, but it's not going to as long as Obama's in office. This is what I'm talking about, managing the expectations of your voters. The problem we're facing in the Republican Party right now is because we have too many people out there saying, elect a Republican Congress and we'll repeal Obamacare. We'll do all these things. When in reality, our founders set up a system to where you just can't do it if you control one house or two houses, or sometimes even the executive, because it's a system that they put into place, and the system works if you let it work. Now, this year, and this is amazing. A couple of notes here of some things that I've talked to so many people, and they said this is the thing, we feel betrayed by the Republicans in Congress. I said, I understand that. I mean, I've been mad too. But do you realize that the House of Representatives in Congress is more conservative today than it's been in 50 years? There are more solid conservative members of Congress than there have been in 50 years. Think back to the Eisenhower or the Nixon administration was very country club elitist Republican. Republicans were the big elitist guys. We have shifted more to a grassroots party. But you wouldn't think that just listening to the media. But the fact is, we are more conservative today than we've been in 50 years. Well, why don't the results show? Well, one is we've got a Senate that isn't doing anything, and two, we have a president that isn't. But the other thing is we have a media that does not want this party to unite at all. Now, I'm one of the harshest critics of the establishment. As Lewis said, I've had some of the big donors of the establishment poke their fingers in my chest and pretty much tell me I'm done with them. And I said, I didn't realize you were there to start with. So yeah, that's okay. But some of the things that, just hit a couple of things. I've had people say you betrayed us because you guys have not repealed Obamacare. So, well, actually in the House of Representatives, we have totally repealed Obamacare, voting it out of the House of Representatives 3 times, and one of those times it actually got to the president's desk and he vetoed it. How many of you knew that? Just about 4 or 5? You know why you didn't know that we actually put a bill on his desk and he vetoed it? Because the day before he did that, he announced an executive order trying to take your guns. It was a strategic move by the president because he knew he could distract the American people toward it. The fact this executive order really didn't do anything. Once we started looking at it, we're like, well, this really does. I mean, I wrote an article about it that went out on Daily Signal, which is Heritage, and it became their second most read article so far this year. Of course, we're still in January, but it had nationwide, it had more than 300 reads a day. But it was very emotionally driven about the executive overreach, and if the president really wants to secure this nation, instead of doing this, he should do these other things. that we have been fighting for. But I was talking to Speaker Ryan about this in a meeting, and he said, the president so much wants to be the center of attention, he's going to do whatever he can to shift the focus back at him. And this was very strategically timed. He did this to help all the gun stores, for one thing. He's the #1 gun seller in the nation. But the other thing is it took the total attention off the fact that he was actually repealing a bill that we sent to his desk that repealed Obamacare. He was vetoing that bill because he knew that if the word got out there on the major media, that would unite this party. They don't even have a candidate. They got a potential felon and a socialist running. I mean, this is the time that we should be having the greatest victory, but we are so divided, and they know how to divide us. They know how to divide us because if they can get us making their talking points, they win. They win. The other thing, Planned Parenthood. How many of you knew that we actually defunded Planned Parenthood and sent the bill to his desk and he vetoed it? Okay? A few more people knew that. You know the reason you didn't know that? Because it was part of the same bill he vetoed when we repealed Obamacare. Because we got all focused over here. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be. But the media wants this party divided as well. So going forward, we need to figure out how we're going to get along with each other and understand that there is a bigger fight that we have to fight. Let me read off some of the things. I mean, I could go through a list of things that we passed out of the House that even haven't gone through the Senate. But these are the things that we've accomplished in Congress this year that have actually been passed into law by the president. He didn't want to, but we actually cut the spending of the federal government back to the 2008 levels. How many of you knew that? Well, it's surprising. Hey, we're still running a deficit, okay? We're still running a deficit. We're still heading toward bankruptcy. I'll talk about that, some things we're doing about that here in just a minute. There was one of the problems with Obamacare, and this is one of the things I said in the campaign. We're not going to be able to repeal Obamacare in whole, but what we can do is start nipping away at it. And it's like going into a machine. You pull enough pins out of a machine, out of the cogs, it's eventually going to collapse on itself. One of the areas of Obamacare was a bailout built in for any insurer that offered insurance plans under the exchanges. There was bailout in case they lost money. Look, I ran a small business for 20 years. Nobody bailed me out if I lost money, or I made bad business decisions, or I went out and undersold, or I sold my product for less than cost. Nobody bailed me out. We actually removed that provision. There's no longer any bailouts for insurance companies under Obamacare. Remember the death panels? We significantly cut the spending on death panels. We tried to get rid of all the death panels, but we cut their spending where they can barely operate. Just on Obamacare, we've delayed several of the taxes that were supposed to go in place this year. We couldn't repeal them, so what we did is we said, well, if we can't get them repealed, let's at least delay their implementation until we get a new president. So we've delayed the medical device tax. I'm trying to remember the other two, but two other taxes that we actually delayed. Now, the two things that have affected our economy more than anything so far has been Obamacare's effect on small businesses, but greater than that is Dodd-Frank. Again, these are things that happened during that Democrat-controlled Congress. Remember when the IRS was going after organizations that were religious or constitutional? They can't do it anymore. We passed a bill, he signed it. They cannot target these organizations anymore. We actually took the IRS, we froze all their funding. They can't hire any more people, any more folks to go after you guys. EPA, we cut the EPA back to their 2010 funding level. We pushed it as far as we could get, but we cut their funding. We also had passed some very key pro-life measures. The Hyde Amendment is something that I put in by a freshman years ago that basically says no bill, no federal funding can go to support abortion. And so we actually got that renewed into law, and the president signed it. One of the other things we've been fighting is in Washington, D.C., the government, the city decided that if you operated a business in Washington, D.C., you had to provide abortion coverage in your insurance plans. Okay, now think about this. You got Concerned Women of America, Family Research Council, National Right to Life. They all have their offices in Washington, D.C., and now the government's telling National Right to Life, you have to provide abortion coverage in your insurance policies. The city did this. Now, the interesting thing about Washington, D.C., it's not a state. There's oversight by Congress. Any ordinance that they pass, we have to approve. Well, we tried to stop that back in the House back in February, March timeframe, and we weren't successful. But we actually overrode that, and the president signed it. We put more border patrol agents on the border because we're about to come out with the strongest border security bill that has ever been in this nation for the southern border. I've been working on it. We actually passed it out of Homeland Security Committee last year. It's coming to the floor in February. We're going to pass it over to the Senate. Now, I'm sure the president's going to veto that unless we can find a way to force him to sign the bills like the speaker did on these. This bill passed the House on December the 18th. The president was forced to sign it on December the 21st. What the bill did is it lifted a 40-year ban on exporting oil, U.S. oil. The United States is the largest producer of crude oil in the world. How many of you knew that? Yeah. We produce more crude oil than Saudi Arabia, than Iran, than Iraq, than Venezuela. It wasn't that way back in the 70s and 80s, but it is now. We're the largest producer of oil because of new technologies like fracking. We produce more oil than any other nation in the world, but for 40 years, oil companies have been banned from selling oil overseas. That has left us very vulnerable because who controls the price per barrel of oil in the world? OPEC. Why are we having record low oil prices right now? Because OPEC decided they were going to put American oil companies out of business. Why? Because we overregulate them and their cost per barrel to produce is so high that these prices out here right now, they lose money. It costs more to produce a gallon of gasoline than they're able to sell it. So Saudi Arabia said, we're going to flood the system with oil. We're going to put American oil companies out of business. We had no say-so. We only import 27% of our fuel. Most of that comes from Canada and Mexico. So we buy very little of OPEC's oil. So even our consumption doesn't influence the market. They totally control the market. Not today, because now we're exporting oil. I had a symposium with 5 national security leaders of this nation. They said, you guys lifting the oil export ban was had the most impact on improving our national security than anything that's been done in decades. Because now we have major influence on the price per barrel of oil. No longer do Middle Eastern countries that are racked with more violence than we've seen in 100 years. The president reluctantly signed that bill on December the 21st. On December the 31st, the first tanker full of American crude oil left the port in Corpus Christi, Texas, on its way to France. France was the first to buy our oil. Why? Because now we are a reliable resource for oil for our allies who were having to buy it